The first time someone called me ma'am, my heart didn't race the way I thought it would. It went quiet like a room where a clock suddenly stops ticking, and for one strange suspended moment, I forgot which version of myself I was supposed to be. I was standing in front of the mirror when it happened, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, just the narrow one in my apartment hallway with a faint crack running through the corner like a scar that never fully healed. I had always avoided that mirror, passed it quickly, caught only fragments of myself, shoulder, jaw, eyes, never the whole picture. That night though I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way the light fell or the way the silence felt heavier than usual. I remember thinking I'd only look for a second. The clothes weren't meant to mean anything. That's what I told myself. They were borrowed for a harmless reason, a practical excuse that sounded convincing even in my own head. But as I adjusted the fabric and watched my reflection shift, something subtle happened. My posture changed before I noticed it. My shoulders softened. My face, always tense, always braced, relaxed into an expression I didn't recognize but somehow knew. The mirror didn't argue with me. It never did. It just showed me what was there. When I stepped outside, the night air felt different against my skin, like the world had changed its rules without telling me. Every step down the sidewalk felt louder than it should have been, every passing glance a question I wasn't ready to answer. I kept my eyes forward, counting breaths, telling myself this was temporary, controlled, reversible. Then the door to the corner store opened, and the cashier looked up and smiled without hesitation. "Next please, ma'am." The word landed gently. No spotlight. No accusation. Just a simple assumption delivered with the same ease as breathing. I opened my mouth to correct them and didn't. Not because I was scared. Not because I was pretending. But because something in me wanted to know what would happen if I let the moment exist without interruption. I paid. I nodded. I left. And as the door closed behind me, I realized my reflection in the darkened glass was no longer just following me. It was leading. I walked home slower than usual, not because I was afraid but because every step felt like it deserved to be noticed. The city hadn't changed, yet it felt newly arranged around me, like I'd stepped into a familiar song played in a different key. Street lights reflected faintly in shop windows, and each time I caught my silhouette, I felt a quiet jolt of disbelief. Not shock, not pride, just recognition hovering at the edge of thought. My apartment door clicked shut behind me, sealing the night out. Inside, the silence returned, thicker now but not uncomfortable. I leaned back against the door and exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath since the store. The mirror in the hallway waited where I'd left it, patient and unblinking. I approached it slowly this time, like someone meeting an old friend after years apart. Up close, the details revealed themselves. The way my eyes looked larger, somehow more awake. The way my mouth rested differently, less guarded. I tilted my head, then straightened it, testing expressions like a language I'd once known but forgotten how to speak. Each movement felt both intentional and instinctive, as if my body had been rehearsing for a moment I'd refused to schedule. A memory surfaced, one I hadn't invited. Standing in my childhood room, holding up a piece of clothing I wasn't supposed to want, listening for footsteps in the hallway. The same mirror back then too, warped at the edges, telling me a truth I wasn't ready to hear. I had learned early how to look away quickly, how to fold curiosity into something smaller and safer. Now years later I stood still and let the mirror finish its sentence. I told myself this didn't mean anything. People make assumptions all the time. Appearances mislead. Tomorrow I'd wake up and everything would be normal again. The words sounded reasonable but they slid off me without sticking. What stayed was the feeling. The strange calm, the absence of friction, the way my thoughts finally stopped arguing with each other. My phone buzzed, breaking the spell. A message from a friend asking if I wanted to meet later in the week. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, suddenly aware of how easily the world could collide with this fragile, private moment. I typed a neutral response, nothing revealing, nothing dishonest. Still, my hands trembled slightly as I hit send. I changed clothes carefully, almost respectfully, folding the fabric instead of tossing it aside. When I hung it up, I hesitated, fingers lingering as if I were saying goodbye to someone who hadn't finished speaking yet. The hallway mirror caught my reflection again. Different now, quieter but not gone. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, one thought followed me, persistent and gentle. What if today wasn't an exception? What if it was an introduction? Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city filtering through the window, replaying the word ma'am over and over until it stopped sounding like language and started sounding like a feeling. Not excitement. Not fear. Something steadier. Like standing on solid ground after years of balancing on loose gravel. When morning finally arrived, it brought a soft, indecisive light with it, the kind that doesn't demand anything right away. I sat up slowly, as if moving too fast might scatter whatever clarity had settled inside me overnight. For a moment I didn't remember why my chest felt tight. Then I saw the hallway mirror from the edge of my vision and everything came rushing back. In daylight things usually lose their magic. Shadows retreat. Illusions dissolve. That's what I expected as I walked toward the mirror again. But what looked back at me wasn't disappointment. It was familiarity, stripped of last night's drama but no less present. The person in the glass didn't feel like a costume anymore. They felt honest. Maybe not complete. Maybe not finished. But honest in a way I hadn't practiced being. I made coffee, the routine grounding me. The clink of the mug, the steam rising, the ordinary comfort of repetition. Yet even that felt altered, as if I were observing myself from a slightly different angle. I noticed how I moved through the kitchen, how my hands rested, how my reflection in the microwave door caught my eye longer than it used to. I wasn't performing. I was existing. The thought scared me more than last night ever did. I had responsibilities. A job. A role I knew how to play. The world had learned my name one way and I'd answered to it without protest for years. The idea of stepping outside that script, even accidentally, felt dangerous, like leaning too far over a railing just to see what's below. I told myself I'd keep things contained. Private. Controlled. But control is a fragile thing when curiosity starts asking better questions. Later that afternoon I stepped outside again, dressed carefully, choosing pieces that felt neutral enough to pass unnoticed yet close enough to that quiet truth I didn't want to lose. Each choice carried weight now. Each decision felt like a small declaration even if no one else could hear it. The hallway outside my apartment seemed longer than usual, every footstep echoing my thoughts back at me. On the street no one stared. No one stopped me. The world moved on with its usual indifference, and somehow that hurt and relieved me at the same time. I caught my reflection in a passing car window and almost smiled before stopping myself, as if joy were something I hadn't earned yet. At a crosswalk someone stood beside me and asked, "Do you know if this light takes long?" I turned, answered automatically, and watched their eyes flicker with the same assumption as last night. Effortless, unexamined. Again I didn't correct them. Again the choice felt less like a lie and more like silence filled with meaning. As the light changed and we crossed together, a realization settled in, heavy and unavoidable. The world wasn't forcing anything on me. I was the one deciding whether to step forward. Would you like to continue to the next part? Continuing, settle in fog. By the time I reached the office, the decision I'd been pretending not to make was already breathing on its own. The building looked the same as always. Glass, steel, people moving with purpose, but I felt like I was approaching it from a different life entirely. The revolving door turned, and with each step inside I felt layers of myself brushing against each other, not colliding, just overlapping. I kept my head down at first, letting routine guide me. Swipe the badge. Nod at the security desk. Walk past the same notice board I'd never read. Yet even these small rituals felt newly charged, as if they were testing me, asking whether I still belonged to them. My reflection appeared again, this time in the polished surface of the elevator doors. The mirror motif followed me everywhere now, refusing to be confined to my hallway. A coworker smiled and said good morning, using a tone I hadn't heard directed at me before. Lighter, warmer, unguarded. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was subtle, and that made it more unsettling than anything else. I returned the greeting, my voice steady, surprised by how natural it sounded. At my desk I focused on the screen, on numbers and words and tasks that demanded attention. Work had always been my anchor, the place where identity narrowed to competence. But even there I felt a shift. I noticed how people addressed me, how conversations bent slightly differently around me, like a river changing course around a stone no one acknowledged out loud. A meeting mid-morning pulled me into a room full of familiar faces. As I took my seat I caught someone hesitating, clearly trying to place me, trying to reconcile memory with perception. The moment passed, unspoken, but it lingered. I felt exposed and invisible at the same time, a paradox that tightened my chest. When it was my turn to speak, I did. Calmly. Hurry. The words came out right, and for a few minutes, everything aligned. My thoughts, my voice, the way people listened. I wasn't thinking about how I was seen. I was just present. And that presence felt like relief. Afterward, alone again, the fear crept back in. Not fear of discovery exactly, but fear of what discovery would require. Once a door opens, pretending it never existed becomes exhausting. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the hum of the office wash over me. A song drifted faintly from someone's headphones nearby, muffled but recognizable. I couldn't name it, but the melody stuck, looping in my mind, becoming another quiet symbol. Something heard but not claimed, felt but not explained. When the day finally ended and I stepped back outside, the sky was turning that soft, uncertain color between afternoon and evening. I realized then that I hadn't been holding my breath all day. I'd been breathing differently. And I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. On the walk home, the city felt closer, like it had leaned in while I wasn't looking. Sounds sharpened, the scrape of shoes on pavement, a bus sighing as it stopped, someone laughing too loudly across the street. Every noise seemed to ask the same quiet question. Who are you today? I didn't answer. I just kept walking, letting the rhythm of my steps carry me forward. At home, the first thing I did was drop my bag and face the hallway mirror again. It had become a checkpoint, a witness. I stood there longer than usual, studying not just how I looked but how I felt looking. The fear was still there, tucked into my ribs, but it was sharing space now with something else. Curiosity maybe, or a cautious pride I didn't know how to name yet. I tried to imagine explaining this to someone. Anyone. The words fell apart before they reached my mouth. How do you describe a shift that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't come with a clear before and after? How do you say, I didn't change overnight, I just stopped resisting something that had been patient for years? I moved through the apartment, touching familiar objects like they might reassure me. The couch. The window. The old framed photo on the shelf from a time when I was smiling the way people expected me to smile. I realized I'd spent most of my life learning how to be legible to others, even when it meant being blurry to myself. That evening, I caught myself humming the melody I'd heard at the office. I didn't know where it came from, but it followed me as I cooked, as I cleaned, as I stood once more in front of the mirror and made small, deliberate adjustments. Nothing dramatic. Just alignment. Like straightening a crooked picture frame until it finally rests right. I imagined stepping outside again. Imagined another assumption, another another moment where the world met me halfway without knowing it. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. Because each time it happened, it felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation. Before bed, I sat on the edge of the mattress and asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What if this isn't something I'm doing? What if this is something I'm allowing? The mirror caught the last light as I turned it off, and in the darkened glass, I saw a version of myself that didn't look finished, but looked possible. And for the first time, possibility felt more powerful than fear. The next few days passed in a quiet blur. Not dramatic, not explosive, just subtly altered, like living in a familiar house after someone has rearranged the furniture in the dark. I knew where everything was, but I still reached out carefully, relearning my own movements. Each morning began the same way now, standing in front of the mirror, not to judge or evaluate, but to check in, as if asking, "Are you still here?" The mirror always answered honestly. I started noticing patterns. How strangers held doors open a second longer. How conversations drifted toward me instead of past me. How my own reactions softened in response, like I was finally allowed to take up space without bracing for impact. None of it was extreme. That was the strangest part. It was all so ordinary it felt radical. One afternoon, I overheard two coworkers talking nearby. They weren't whispering, but they weren't trying to be heard either. Just casual voices, unguarded. "She's new, right?" one of them said. "I think so," the other replied. "She seems nice." The words hit me harder than they should have. Not because they were wrong or right, but because they existed without my consent, without my effort. An identity placed gently on my shoulders, not demanded, not challenged. I sat there staring at my screen, feeling something tighten and then loosen inside me. Nice. Simple words. Yet they carried a weight I hadn't expected. I wasn't being watched for flaws. I wasn't being measured against old expectations. I was just there. Later, alone in the restroom, I caught my reflection again. Different lighting, harsher angles. For a moment, doubt crept in. The old voice tried to reclaim space, listing reasons this couldn't last, couldn't be real, couldn't be safe. I listened without fighting it, then let it finish speaking. Silence followed. I washed my hands slowly, deliberately, grounding myself in the cool water, the familiar gesture. When I looked up again, the mirror showed someone steadier than before. Not fearless. Not certain. But no longer pretending this was accidental. On the way home, the song returned. The same melody, this time clearer, like it had been waiting for me to pay attention. I didn't hum it away. I let it exist, walking in time with it, feeling the rhythm settle into my chest. That night as I lay in bed, I realized something that unsettled me more than fear ever had. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was waiting for courage. And the space between those two things was getting smaller every day. Would you like to continue to the next part? The first crack appeared on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually passes without leaving a mark. I was waiting for coffee, half listening to the barista call out orders, when someone behind me leaned forward and said my name, the one I'd always used, the one that suddenly felt too sharp in the air. They'd recognized me. An old acquaintance. Not close, but close enough to remember. I turned slowly, the way you do when you already know the conversation won't be simple. Their eyes moved over me, not rudely, just searching, trying to reconcile memory with what stood in front of them. The pause stretched. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't since this began, like the world had switched languages mid-sentence. For a moment I considered correcting everything, explaining, clarifying, shrinking back into something easier to categorize. That I just smiled. We exchanged polite words, careful ones. They avoided pronouns altogether, navigating around me like a fragile object they didn't want to break. When my coffee was ready, I took it gratefully, using the interruption as an exit. As I stepped outside, my hands were shaking, not from shame but from the effort of holding my ground without fully understanding what that ground was yet. The mirror motif followed me again, this time in the dark surface of my phone as I checked the time. I looked at my reflection and realized something unsettling. It hurt more to imagine going backward than to risk moving forward. At home, the fear finally caught up with me. What if someone else recognized me? What if questions turned into confrontations? What if this quiet acceptance had an expiration date? I paced the apartment, the song looping in my head, faster now, less soothing, like a reminder that movement doesn't stop just because you're tired. I sat down and let myself feel it all. The fear, the uncertainty, the ache of wanting something I couldn't yet name. For the first time, I didn't rush to distract myself or explain it away. I let the discomfort exist. It didn't destroy me. When I stood and faced the hallway mirror again, I noticed the crack more clearly than ever. It split my reflection just slightly, dividing and duplicating me. And yet both halves felt real. I touched the glass not to fix it but to acknowledge it. Maybe I didn't need to choose a side tonight. Maybe surviving the question was enough. The days that followed were quieter, almost deceptively calm. I moved through them like someone testing the surface of ice, unsure if it would hold me or crack underfoot. At work, the assumptions continued. Simple, unspoken, effortless. Each she or ma'am was like a pebble tossed into still water, rippling quietly through my sense of self. I didn't correct them, not because I wanted to deceive, but because each ripple made me realize how much I had wanted this acknowledgement all along. At home, I began small rituals. Arranging clothes in a way that felt intentional. Brushing hair in longer, slower strokes. Adjusting the folds of a shirt to see how light played across the fabric. Each act was private, mundane, yet profoundly intimate. I wasn't performing. I was experimenting, learning how it felt to exist in a version of myself I'd only glimpsed in dreams and fleeting reflections. One evening, a neighbor stopped me in the hall. Casual words, a friendly smile, but the way they addressed me was gentle, unforced. They assumed and I let it stand. The world had no manual for this. There was no script, no rulebook. And for the first time I realized the power in silence, in letting the moment exist uncorrected, unchallenged. I caught myself thinking about the crack in the mirror again, tracing it with my eyes. It wasn't a flaw. It was a boundary, a mark of growth. A reminder that reflections are never perfect but still entirely truthful. I began to see that the mirror wasn't just a witness. It was a guide, showing me who I could be if I dared to accept it. That night, I hummed the melody again, letting it fill the apartment. Each note felt like a pulse, a heartbeat connecting me to something beyond the walls, beyond the assumptions, beyond even my own fears. I realized that every day, every glance, every word not corrected, was teaching me the same lesson. Acceptance begins in silence. I lay in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, feeling both smaller and larger than I had in years. The tension between fear and possibility had not disappeared, but it had shifted. I was no longer running from it. I was learning to move alongside it. And deep down, a whisper began to take shape. Perhaps this could be permanent. Perhaps it could be real. Perhaps it was already both. The weekend arrived, and with it an unfamiliar freedom. No meetings, no deadlines, no external expectations demanding I perform the old version of myself. I spent hours wandering through the city streets, watching sunlight scatter across glass buildings, feeling the subtle brush of wind against my skin. Every reflection caught in windows, cars, and puddles made me pause, just long enough to wonder who I was when no one was looking, and whether that version of me deserved to be seen. I stopped at a small park bench and sat, hands resting on my knees, listening to children laughing and dogs barking, the ordinary soundtrack of a life that had always felt separate from mine. I noticed how my posture had changed without my permission, how my shoulders carried a softness I hadn't remembered possessing. The world seemed to treat me differently, or maybe it wasn't the world. Maybe it was me noticing it for the first time. A passerby complimented my coat, calling it lovely, with no hesitation. I smiled, nodded, and kept walking, heart beating just slightly faster than usual. That simple exchange, harmless on the surface, felt monumental. Validation didn't come from correction or explanation. It came from presence. From being acknowledged. From being allowed to exist in a form I hadn't dared fully claim. By evening, I returned home, carrying a sense of exhaustion that felt more like relief than fatigue. I moved slowly, intentionally toward the mirror. The crack no longer seemed jagged, threatening. It was just part of the frame, a reminder that no reflection is perfect, and that imperfection is allowed, even beautiful. I stood there for a long time, silent, touching the glass lightly, imagining all the versions of myself that had been hidden behind caution, habit, and fear. And for the first time, I didn't imagine correcting the world. I imagined stepping into it fully as I was, letting it see me, even if only for a moment. Later that night, lying in bed, I realized something. The tension between fear and possibility had begun to collapse. The version of myself that had trembled at assumptions, that had practiced explanations in front of the mirror, was still there, but quieter, less commanding. In its place rose something unfamiliar, something I hadn't named but recognized in the smallest victories, in the quiet silences, in the simple act of letting moments exist without interference. And for the first time, I felt a kind of pride I hadn't known I could claim. Monday arrived like a gentle challenge. The office was unchanged, desks, chairs, fluorescent lights. But I walked through the revolving door with a new awareness, almost as if I were noticing it for the first time. Every step felt deliberate. Every movement a quiet declaration. I carried myself differently now. Not performative, not exaggerated, but aligned in a way that felt authentic. People greeted me as they always had, yet something was different. Their words, their glances carried no suspicion, no judgment. Just simple acknowledgement. I noticed it in small things. A nod, a smile, the ease in conversation. And for the first time I realized the truth I had been avoiding. The world doesn't demand your labels. It responds to your presence. How you inhabit space matters more than the words you use to define yourself. During a meeting, I caught someone glance at me, an unspoken question in their eyes. Normally, I would have shifted uncomfortably, ready to explain or retreat. But today I didn't flinch. I held their gaze for a moment, just long enough to let the silence speak, to let the possibility exist without naming it. And in that silence, I felt something expand inside me. An acceptance that wasn't granted by others but earned by simply showing up as myself. The reflection motif haunted me all day. Every window, every screen, every shiny surface offered a small mirror. Each reflection was a test. Would I see the person I thought I should be or the one I was becoming? I chose the latter, tracing small gestures. Tilt of the head, curve of the shoulders, softening of the gaze. Until I felt the person in the reflection and the person in my chest merge into something coherent, something real. By evening, exhaustion settled over me, but it was the kind of exhaustion that comes from growth, not fear. Standing in front of my hallway mirror, I lingered, brushing my hair gently and adjusting my clothes with care. The crack in the glass glinted faintly, reminding me that imperfections don't erase authenticity, they frame it. For the first time I thought about tomorrow not with dread but with curiosity. How would the world respond if I continued this quiet experiment? How would I respond to myself? And for the first time the answer didn't terrify me. It thrilled me. Because I knew finally that the moment I had been waiting for wasn't out there in the world. It was right here in the mirror, in me, in the choice to keep walking forward. That night, I lingered longer than usual in front of the mirror, letting my eyes trace every line, every shadow, every detail that made this version of me recognizable yet new. The crack in the corner seemed smaller somehow, or maybe I was seeing it differently, less as a flaw and more as a marker of survival, proof that the reflection could endure fractures and still be whole. I thought about the people I'd encountered over the past week. Strangers, coworkers, acquaintances, even that old friend who nearly recognized me. In every interaction I hadn't corrected assumptions. I hadn't protested. And in every one I had learned something about myself. That quiet acceptance, that small allowance of possibility, had begun to reshape my understanding of who I could be. I sat on the floor back against the wall, holding my knees, feeling the day settle like dust around me. Fear had been present, yes, but it had softened. It no longer demanded attention. It was no longer a warning. It was simply part of the texture of life, like the background hum of a city I had stopped noticing. And in its place, something stronger had grown. The ability to claim myself quietly without fanfare or justification. The melody, the song that had threaded through my thoughts all week, played softly in my head. I hummed along this time not to distract myself, but to celebrate the small victories of presence and patience, of courage built from silence rather than spectacle. I realized that transformation hadn't happened in the mirror, hadn't been granted by others. It had happened inside me, piece by piece, choice by choice, moment by moment. For the first time I didn't wonder if I could sustain this. I knew I could. I didn't need the world to acknowledge me. I only needed myself. The mirror caught my gaze once more, steady, unblinking. And I smiled, not the polite, careful smile I'd practiced for years, but the one that came from knowing I had stepped into something I hadn't dared imagine before. And in that quiet, ordinary yet profoundly extraordinary moment, I felt complete enough. Here's the final part, the resolution and emotional closing. Full moon. The next morning I woke with a calm I hadn't known for years. The anxiety that usually tangled itself around the first thought of the day had softened into something lighter, almost imperceptible. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately, brushing my hair, making coffee, watching the light shift across the walls. Even ordinary tasks felt significant, like a quiet ceremony honoring a self I had long kept hidden. At the mirror I paused. I studied the familiar face, the subtle shadows, the lines that had always defined me. But now I didn't search for flaws or rehearse corrections. I simply observed. I acknowledged. I accepted. The reflection was neither perfect nor complete, but it was mine, and that was enough. Stepping outside, the world seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different. People passed, smiled, spoke, and assumed, and I let them. Not out of fear or pretense or desire to deceive, but because I had finally realized the truth I'd been avoiding. My identity wasn't a label for others to confirm. It was a choice I made in every gesture, every silence, every uncorrected assumption. I walked with a lightness I hadn't felt before, letting each step carry me forward rather than holding me back. The city became a mirror, reflecting not just my image but the possibility of being fully present in my own skin. And in that presence, I felt a joy I hadn't dared name. The quiet thrill of authenticity, the deep ache of relief, the strange, grounding power of self-acceptance. Returning home, I glanced at the hallway mirror one last time that evening. The crack gleamed faintly, a reminder of the imperfections that had accompanied me all along. I reached out, traced it gently with a finger, and whispered a silent acknowledgement. Thank you for enduring, for witnessing, for showing me that transformation isn't about perfection. It's about courage, presence, honesty. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need anyone else's recognition to be real. I didn't need to correct the world because I had finally corrected myself. I was here. I existed. And for the first time in a long time, it felt undeniably right.